Well, hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar from wherever you might be joining us today. Thank you for subscribing and attending. I'm Nicoleta Pasecinic, and I will be presenting today about the EU novel food updates, specifically how the new novel food regulation made it easier for applicants within the last 2 years. Before we start, I would like you to tell some things. So first, all the slides that you will see today and the recording of this webinar, you will receive them on your email after this webinar. Please use the chat function to signal any audio or visual problems that you might have. And lastly, if you have any questions regarding to this webinar or to this presentation, please leave them in the chat or send me an email after this webinar, and I will happily reply to them after this. So let's start. How is our webinar going to be structured? So I'll start by refreshing our mind on the novel food authorization. So specifically, what is the process like? We're also going to look at some numbers. So the amount of novel food authorizations in the last years, how many, how long. We're also going to look at EFSA evaluation. So how long are they in reality? We're going to go a bit deeper into EFSA's evaluation, specifically looking at the number of clock stops that the applications receive, what is included in those clock stops, and how many clock stops. I will then follow up talking about data protection. So what is data protection? And specifically the type of data that you have to request or you have to put in your dossier in order to request a data protection. I will then talk about the transparency regulation and how it will affect the novel food regulation once it gets implemented a year from now. I will also introduce some case studies, specifically case study where EFSA has concluded negatively on the safety assessment. And we will finish with some Q&A. So these are some of the questions that you have sent to me when you have been registering for the webinar. So if time permits, I'll try to attempt to answer all of them. And I'll also check the chat inbox to see if you have sent me any other new questions. So let's just dive straight in. As you already might be aware, in 2018, the new novel food regulation got implemented. And it was new because it implemented a new centralized procedure for authorizing novel food. So what did that mean? That the novel food dossier was submitted directly to the European Commission, and then the novel food dossier was assessed or is assessed by EFSA. Whereas previously, the novel food dossiers had to be submitted to member states. So that step in the new novel food process is being bypassed. And with this new centralized procedure, the European Commission hoped to halve the time that the novel foods would be evaluated and then authorized. So they were hoping to get the timeline for approval just under 1.5 years. So before we actually see if these timelines have been complied with, I think it's going to be a good idea to just refresh exactly what are those steps in the novel food authorization process. Okay. So here we have the applicant, which can be either the European Commission or the food business operator, and it will submit the dossier to the European Commission, as I said, through an online submission portal. And that And then after the European Commission receives this application, it will perform a validation step. What does that mean? That it will just check that the information you have provided is complete. And that usually takes about a month to 3 months. And once the European Commission has validated your application, it will decide whether a risk assessment is necessary or not. So far, with all the novel food applications that came in, the European Commission requested EFSA for a risk assessment. So we're going to look at that route now. So once EFSA receives the application, which the European Commission confirmed is validated, EFSA again performs an in-house validation to check that all the pertinent data is ready to be evaluated. And then once that is done, the clock starts. So from when EFSA starts evaluating your application until it delivers a scientific opinion, it usually takes about 9 months. However, you see this little clock stop here, we call them clock stops, which just means that at some point during the evaluation, EFSA can come back to the applicant and ask for additional questions. And once that happens, the evaluation is stopped. So that's why we say clock stop. Once the EFSA delivers its scientific opinion, it is then presented to the European Commission, and then the European Commission discusses it at comitology. And then if it decides to go ahead, it will draft an implementing act. And then usually this process takes about 7 months. And I think I would like also to note that it is the EFSA Panel on Nutrition, Novel Food and Food Allergens, short for NDA, who is the one that discusses and adopts all the scientific opinion. And I think it's interesting to know that they are still functioning, they're still working even due to the coronavirus situation that we're all in. And in their last meeting, just at the end of March, they have adopted 4 new scientific novel food opinions. So that is really positive. Let's just look a bit further into how EFSA actually evaluates your application. So it receives the mandate from the European Commission. This is the EFSA NDA panel, and then it will form an EFSA working group. And the EFSA working group is composed of scientific experts that come from different disciplines. And they are actually the one who are going to evaluate the risk of your novel food, and they're the one who are going to draft the scientific opinion. So this scientific opinion is then presented back to the NDA panel, and the NDA panel will then discuss it and then adopt it. So here you see a screenshot of one of the latest, so 23 to 25th of March, one of the latest panel meetings where they have discussed the adoption of new novel food. And you can see here the panel members. I also forgot to mention that whilst the working group is performing their evaluation, they can contract hearing experts either internally or externally from EFSA, just to get a bit more specialized knowledge on the novel food. European Commission also attends the panel meetings, and then other EFSA personnel are attending. Okay, so you know now what is the novel food application process, what is the new novel food application process, and I just wanted to take a step back and go again through what was the old novel food application process, and just to compare a bit. So for your purposes, for your reference, I just have put here the summarized novel food process, and also on your right, you can see the summarized diagram for the new novel food process. So how was it under the old novel food regulation? Well, 70% of the dossiers had well, all the dossiers actually had to be submitted to a member state rapporteur. This could be any member state, and that member state had to deliver an initial assessment. That initial assessment had to then be shared with all the other 27 member states. And if just one member state raised safety objections on your novel food, then it had to go through EFSA evaluation. So your whole dossier had to be evaluated again by EFSA. So all these, it seems that there have been 3 different steps at which your food was evaluated, but actually just only 70% of the dossiers went through this route. Still, it's quite an elongated route when you compare to the more simplified one. So the best time to approval from our knowledge is the Clostridium botulicum novel food, which was 3 years. So the average was 3.5 years for novel foods under the old process. And from my own knowledge, the longest approval was for a cranberry extract. And that took really long, 7 years. So if we compare the novel foods that went under the old process with the new process, I think we can definitely agree that the time has been shortened. But let's see actually in reality if the numbers tell us that. So here you see a graphic, and it shows you the EFSA and the EC workflow in the past 5 years. So first, I want you to pay attention to the bars under the 2014 and 2017 period. And I just want you to know that these numbers in these bars represent averages, whereas the ones under 2018 and 2019, they actually represent absolute numbers, okay? So the blue bars, what do they represent? These are the number of applications received by the European Commission. The orange bars, they represent the numbers of scientific opinions published, and the yellow bars represent the number of authorizations. So what do we notice? Well, first is that every year, the number of applications received are much higher than the numbers of authorizations. Also, probably this is the most noticeable one, compared to the previous years, 2014 and 2017, the numbers of the applications have increased dramatically. So you can definitely, it's a 5-fold increase from how it used to be under the old novel food process. Then another thing that it's interesting to see is that the authorizations are actually, they're staying the same level as previous years. So about an average of 7 authorizations per year. Although in 2019, actually the authorizations were, the number of authorizations were less than the ones in 2018. So you might think that just by looking at this graph that the duration of, or the timeline of a novel food process actually stayed the same, because the EFSA scientific opinions published, they have not really been changed. And also the number of the authorizations also haven't increased. But let's look a bit more into detail. So here you see a different graph. And so what I have done is that I looked at the timelines until authorization, so from submission until authorizations of the last 4 novel foods that were authorized, so the most recent one. And then in a red line, you will shortly see are the applications under old novel food regulations, so the average timeline for those applications. If we start, we can notice that from the time when the dossier was submitted until it was validated, it took approximately 2 to 7 months. This is quite different from what we have saw in the theoretical timelines, where we saw 1 to 3 months there. And I think it's mostly related to the fact that the dossiers are not complete. So EFSA and the European Commission have to go back to the applicant to request to provide them the complete dossier before they actually start the EFSA evaluation. Okay, so once the European Commission has validated your application, all of the novel foods receive at least 1 clock stop. So that usually takes within 3 months from the validation. Skip 2 more 3 months and almost 70% receive a second clock stop. From the time when EFSA has started their evaluation until it has adopted a scientific opinion, 9 months have passed. So actually we are seeing that EFSA is following the timelines stipulated in the novel food regulation. And from when EFSA opinion is published, which is a month after it is adopted, until the European Commission authorizes your product by drafting an implementing regulation to update the union list, this takes 7 months. So definitely this timeline is also followed by the European Commission. Now, on average, if you put them together, it is exactly 1.5 years. However, if you see this red line, so this is the line that represents the timelines under the novel food regulation, then you can definitely see the difference, right? Okay. Now I want to take some time and look into the clock stop. So this is a table which I have put together using some of the latest scientific opinions, and I have looked at the number of clock stops and their duration. So what can we see? That, as I said before, most of them, well, all of them receive 1 clock stop, at least 1 clock stop. The majority of the applications will receive a second clock stop, and quite few will receive a 3rd clock stop. So the first observation is that actually the difference in duration of these clock stops, they're not, of the first and the second clock stop, they're not that different. And I think it also means that the duration of your first clock stop will not necessarily predict what's going to be the duration of your second clock stop if you are sort of expecting a second clock stop. Third, we can see that the range for the total duration of your clock stop, they are 3 to 28 weeks. And then the average length of clock stops is 13 weeks. I think it's also important to show you that the application under 2018 that had 3 clock stops and had the highest duration of a clock stop of 28 weeks was heat-killed bacteria. Okay, I think it's time for a poll question to see if you still are with me and are engaged in this webinar. So I want you to tell me if you think if the amount and duration of clock stops per application are indicators of incomplete data set. So is it because EFSA is not happy with the amount of data, with the quality of data that is not compliant with the EFSA guidance? Is it because the novel food identity is quite complex, so perhaps there is not much literature on it? Could it be because EFSA working group is speaking? Or all of the above? So I'm going to just activate the poll, and I will give you just some time to pick your answer. So we have currently 39 attendees. Wow, I'm really impressed by your answers. I didn't expect this. So let's wait for 2 or 3 more and then I can publish the results. Okay, I think we're done. So if I share with you the results, the chosen answer, if you see, a majority of you have chosen incomplete data set. And I totally agree with you. One of them is incomplete data set, but actually I would pick all of them. So the amount of clock stops that you receive and also the duration of them, it will depend first, yes, on incomplete data set, but it also might be that your novel food is so new that EFSA just does not have enough information on it. So it will just keep asking more specific details on it. And funny enough, nobody has picked EFSA working group is picky. I think what I meant here was that perhaps EFSA just wants to pick on some clues on your novel food. So if there's not much information that they can pick on and they're out of time, then it might be that you find them a bit picky. But I guess that is case by case. Okay, I'll stop sharing now and we can move on with the presentation. So now I just want to take some time and actually look at the type of additional information that EFSA has requested from the applicant once the evaluation stops. So I have looked at the clock stops of different applications, and I have grouped the questions in the clock stops based on main topics. And and these are the main topics: toxicological information, stability, and production process. And specifically one application, if you remember, this was the one that had 3 clock stops and the longest length of clock stops. EFSA also asked about specifications, target population, and to clarify the proposed uses. So I'm just going to take the time to actually go through these questions on these topics. So for toxicological information, the questions are divided under subtopics. So the questions were related to susceptibility to antimicrobials, genotoxicity, subchronic toxicity, and other toxicity studies. And for example, EFSA asked to clarify on the intrinsic or acquired character of the antimicrobials of the Mycobacterium manresensis microorganism. And specifically, EFSA was interested whether the specific antimicrobial resistance was intrinsic rather than acquired. Another question that EFSA asked in relation to genotoxicity was for the applicant to repeat one of the in vitro genotoxicity study because the results were just not conclusive. For subchronic toxicity, EFSA was interested in seeing a different analysis. So it asked the applicant to perform a benchmark dose assessment. And the benchmark dose assessment is an alternative to the no adverse effects level. And EFSA actually considers it more effective than the NOAEL. And I think it was in this case that the study, the subchronic toxicity study, the doses that it used and the NOAEL derived, it was too low. And this is actually a question that we see with a lot of the clock stops, where EFSA requires the applicant to submit the full study reports and to submit any unpublished studies. So although this is specified in the EFSA guidance, a lot of applicants don't provide it at first, but EFSA still comes back and still requests them. For other toxicological studies, EFSA has asked well, not again, but to run a new in vitro study to investigate if so in this case, PC is phenylcapsaicin. It was the application for phenylcapsaicin, and EFSA just wanted to know whether phenylcapsaicin behaves in the same way as the capsaicin. So what I mean is whether it provides the same adverse reaction when it's in contact with skin. In regards to questions on stability, EFSA wanted to see the interim results of the bulk stability of the novel food. And in regards to the production process, so this is mostly related, this is only related to those novel foods where you have a microorganism or a novel food made by fermentation, where EFSA required the applicant to demonstrate the absence of DNA from the GM production strain in the novel food, and to also demonstrate the validity on how this DNA was detected from the production organism. Okay, so we have looked at the type of data that, or the type of questions that EFSA has requested in their clock stops. I want to take some time to look at the type of data that you can provide in order to substantiate your requirement for or request for data protection. So what is data protection actually? Data protection is given to those applicants that provide data that is proprietary to them, that it can be published or unpublished, but at the time of submission, it has to be new and it has to be proprietary. And another condition is that the data has to be used and has to be used to conclude on the safety. Okay. And this data protection is usually given for a period of 5 years once your novel food is authorized. And for the nine applications that we have looked at so far for the clock stop review, 6 out of 9 of those asked for data protection. So what I have done then, I have looked at the data that was requested by those applicants and have put in bullet points all of the data that has been considered and granted data protection from. So we know that for any type of toxicity study, mostly EFSA will grant data protection. So here you see genotoxicity studies, acute oral dose range finding studies, subchronic oral toxicity studies, even human dietary studies. So all those clinical trials that show that your product is safe can also be requested for data protection. Sorry, I'm just going to take some water. Following, we also see that applicants have requested and the European Commission has approved that the in vivo and in vitro metabolic studies to be approved for data protection. Also, in terms of nutrition, if you show, in this case, the applicant showed that the novel food structure was similar to a human nutrient homologue. So it did ask for the European Commission for data protection for that type of study. This is really interesting. I found it really interesting. So apparently all the annexes that related to the identity production process, production organism composition and specifications, also the COAs, they have also been granted data protection. And interestingly, Appendix B3, if you're not familiar to Appendix B3, this is a table that summarizes all the statistically significant results from the 90-day toxicity study. And this table is provided in an appendix. It is not obligatory to provide it in your dossier, but EFSA does recommend it. And so in this case, where the applicant has, requested, the European Commission has provided data protection for it. So I just want to put a disclaimer here that all these bullet points that you see here, they were not provided, they were not requested just for one study. So the data protection usually is given to if you provide toxicity study, and in additional to that, you provide all these other bullet points that you have seen here. So if you have in addition ADME studies or annexes, they will be considered as a whole lot. Then I wanted to show you something interesting. So you provide the request, as an applicant, you provide the request for data protection at the start. So when you submit the application to the European Commission. So the European Commission, once it gets the EFSA opinion on your dossier, it will assess whether EFSA has concluded that specific studies were needed from the applicant to agree or conclude on the data protection, but also the European Commission itself will contact the applicant and will ask for justifications again for why it has requested data protection. So here you see a screenshot of a very standard reply received from applicants where they justify that at the time of submission, that data was under their own proprietary exclusive right. So no other third party is allowed to use those studies for any other use or refer to that data. And this justification seems to work. Okay, let's look now at the type of studies that it actually was a bit inconclusive. I couldn't really understand whether the data protection was allowed or was not allowed, again, because they were bundled sort of in the same request. But from what I understand, the intake assessment reports, the analytical methods and validation reports, the stability reports, and the laboratory accreditation certificates, they were not granted data protection. Okay, so now that we have looked at the type of data under data protection, let's look now at the transparency regulations. So what is transparency regulation and why is there so much talk about it? And how exactly is it going to influence novel food regulation? Well, transparency regulation, as it says, the aim is to improve the transparency process of how products are regulated in the European Commission. And so when it becomes effective, which is a year from now on the 27th of March 2021, it will influence a lot of the regulations regarding the regulated product, as you can see here. We are specifically interested from the novel food standpoint in the changes applicable to general food law, but also applicable to novel foods. So I have marked the date in red, 27th of March 2021, because I do think regulatory affairs managers should take this date in serious. There's a lot of changes applicable, and let's go through them now, actually. So how will the changes to the general food law, because of the implementation of the new transparency regulation, how will those changes affect novel food applications? So, a positive one, applicants will be able to request a pre-submission consultation with EFSA, where they will be able to ask about questions such as the type of content in the dossiers and any rules applicable specifically for their product. Second, EFSA will comply or will make a database of studies. But this means that the applicant at the time when it plans to run studies, then the laboratory will have to notify the studies to EFSA. So EFSA will make a database. We don't know if this will be public or not, but this will be a new requirement. Once these studies are notified, then EFSA can actually consult with other stakeholders, even with the public, to check on the study design, to check their opinions on how the study was carried out. And if some issues are identified with, for example, the results of the studies, then EFSA can run their own verification studies to just check. And in that same thinking, EFSA is planning to, sorry, not EFSA, the European Commission is planning to put together a group of experts that can travel to that laboratory or a CRO to check how those tests were performed and if they comply with any quality standards. European Commission will make available publicly some standard data formats. So that means that all the applications will be submitted in a standardized document, as well as any supplementary information too. Confidentiality will still be able to be requested. However, confidentiality will be analyzed now by EFSA. So currently, confidentiality is given by the European Commission, but that responsibility will turn to EFSA. Third, personal data will be protected. So this is in relevance to toxicological studies. So the people or the investigators that were involved in running animal toxicity studies, their name and contact details, they will be protected. And lastly, transparency. So what will actually be released to the public? Let's look that into the next slide. So EFSA will make available to the public the entire dossier. So your entire novel food dossier. What that means, you will have to submit, well, you have to prepare and submit two different two different versions of the same dossier, one that is confidential and one that is non-confidential. And the non-confidential application will be the one that will be submitted online for the public to see. That also means that all of the data, all of the studies, including the supplementary information, they will also be made available online. Any summary advice of those pre-consultation meetings, that will also be made available online. And lastly, if any other stakeholders or third parties were consulted, their opinions will also be made available online. That being said, intellectual property data, so what we were talking about, the data that you want to be protected and not be available to everyone, that will still be in place and that will be guaranteed. Because up until now, as you understood, all the data protection has to be justified by the applicants, but hopefully with the new transparency regulation, this will be more guaranteed. Okay, now we're approaching to the very end of our presentation. And here I just want to share with you some interesting thoughts on the EFSA's negative opinion on the novel food, which is viable embryonated eggs of a whipworm. But before that, why this is so interesting is that actually EFSA publishes negative opinion not that often. So the last one that I identified was in 2017, and it was for a polysaccharide complex. You see here alginate conjunct xanthan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. So the issue with this polysaccharide was first that this polysaccharide was already on a Canadian and US market, and EFSA could identify adverse reaction reports of people who were using that polysaccharide at the time when the dossier was submitted. So it already had evidence of adverse reactions from human consumption. And paired with another consideration, which is low margin of exposure. And that means that the margin of exposure from what was considered a safe dose that was derived from the no adverse effects level to the proposed intake was just too low. So then EFSA did not conclude on the safety of this polysaccharide. So what about the viable embryonated eggs? So EFSA in 2019 has published the opinion on why was it negative? Well, the embryonated eggs are from Trichurus suis, and this, if you know, it's a parasite that lives in the intestines of pigs. So just by hearing about it, it doesn't really sound that it is fit for human consumption. But let's look a bit more closer to the how the applicant wanted to manufacture this product. So the pigs were inoculated with the embryonated eggs, the live embryonated eggs. After 49 days of incubation, the fecal matter was collected. The eggs were isolated and purified, and you see here that at this stage the eggs were not embryonated. After some days to left them to mature, they became embryonated, as you can see here, and then the applicant wanted to sell them as a suspension, as a food supplement. So that was the idea. And actually this type of food was already being sold in Thailand. So it was really interesting. But what did EFSA argue then? So EFSA said that the food had no nutritional relevance, that there were a lot of studies showing that once this food hatched in the intestines of humans, it could grow, reproduce, and therefore become invasive to humans. And most of all, there were already a lot of reports showing adverse gastrointestinal reactions because humans were contaminated with this parasite. So clearly EFSA said, well, this product is not safe, and no safe dose can be derived to ascertain that there's no safety concerns from consumption of this product. So what did the applicant actually provide to suggest that this product is safe? Well, from the scientific opinion, it is quite clear that the data package on safety was not complete. EFSA had to undergo its own safety evaluation, and it has identified in that process a lot of studies that showed, well, that the product was did raise safety concerns. Secondly, it seemed that the applicant did have information or results on the 13-week repeated dose toxicity, which was done in monkeys, and on the reproductive developmental toxicity study in rabbits. However, at EFSA's request, these studies were not provided by the applicants. So considering this, that EFSA could not see the actual data, knowing that that is a requirement under the EFSA guidance, then it does make sense that EFSA did have concerns with this product. So we came to the end of the presentation. I just want to take some minutes to summarize what we have learned today. So we have seen that the number of novel food applications in the last 2 years compared to the 2014 and 2017 period has increased dramatically, over 5-fold. So this is quite positive news, because it does mean that the industry thinks that it has higher chances of penetrating the EU market. Secondly, we have seen that the EFSA evaluation does follow the novel food regulation timelines. So even if clock stops are released, the total amount, the average EFSA evaluation timeline is about 9 months, and the total time to approval is 1.5 years on average. We saw that most applications get 2 clock stops, that per application, the duration or the length of a clock stop is about 13 weeks. And this actually accounts for 1/3 of the application evaluation by EFSA. The main topic for clock stops, as we have seen, is toxicity. Data protection. Data protection is mostly given if you have toxicity data. But you have to show if your conclusion on safety is dependent on the data, and if the data is proprietary to you at the time of submission. These are 2 important conditions that you need to check. The transparency regulation, the 27th of March 2021, that's when it becomes effective, which is about a year from now. And from then on, all the novel food dossiers, they will be released to the public. And lastly, we have seen that some of the reasons why EFSA does not conclude on safety, is because safety was not proven. And as we saw with the whipworm, the viable eggs of the whipworm, the novel food did not have any nutritional relevance. Okay, so these were the main take-home points. Let's now move on to some of the questions that I have received prior this webinar, and I will take some time now to answer them. So we have about 10 minutes left. Yeah, a bit more than 10 minutes left. So the first question was, it has become tougher. So it has become tougher over the years to achieve registration. Also, the regulation appears to be less of a hurdle to calorific and bulky nutrients than to bioactive compounds like botanicals. What do you think? Okay, my own personal opinion is that I don't think that the registration became necessarily tougher over the years. I think, as we saw, the procedure for getting your product authorized onto the market has been simplified, and that also has caused for the timelines to shrink. We also have to take into consideration that previously your novel food had to be authorized by almost like in 3 different steps, so having almost 3 independent risk assessments. So that means that with the new procedure, you only have to really know about EFSA's requirements. And even so, the EFSA working group and the panel, they do change every 3 years. Still, the guidances are still in place. So applicants do know the type of data that they need to provide in advance. So taking that into consideration, I do think that the process has become more simplified, a bit easier. But I do agree, though, that once the transparency regulation will become effective, that might cause more hurdles. So if to consider that you will have to prepare 2 applications, sorry, not 2 applications, one dossier under 2 versions, a non-confidential and a confidential version, that already means more resources, more time. That also means that you're more prone to make mistakes, and there is more possibility of increasing inconsistency of information between those 2 versions. So that is one problem. But I also anticipate that applicants who will want to provide even less information, since they know that the dossiers will be available to the public, they will try to provide less information. So from EFSA's point of view, will that mean that they will increase the number of clock stops given? I'm not really sure about that. But we also have to take into consideration that this is also new for EFSA. So it might take some time for them too to actually understand how to incorporate the changes from the transparency regulation, and whether it's going to increase the timeline that they will have to spend on the evaluation. But we will have to see. I think a year from when the transparency regulation is going to become effective, we're going to be able to analyze better the situation then. In regards to your second questions, or your second comment, that so botanicals, they're harder to evaluate than the bulky calorific nutrients. Well, I do agree with you. I think generally there's a consensus that nutrients, they're just easier to identify and detect, whereas with botanicals, you have so many active ingredients in the composition of that botanical that it's usually really hard to detect, identify, quantify all of those active ingredients. So that means that you're not really certain of the composition of your novel food. So if you cannot confirm your composition, and that sort of tells EFSA that you're not really sure about the identity of your botanical. So that is one hurdle that I see with botanicals. I think another one, which is also important, is with botanicals, you can have impurities with it. So depending on how the degradation of this impurity goes, they can be a reason for concern, for safety concern. So in that case, you really need to provide a very good literature review to see how these impurities behave. And also with stability studies, you can check for these impurities, how do they behave, and then see if that helps. Let's move to our second question. I'm just going to look at the time. Okay, we have time. So the second question is, are human safety studies needed for a novel food application? Okay, so the immediate answer is no, not necessarily. If you have in vitro and in vivo toxicological data, that should be enough to prove safety, okay? However, if you do have human safety studies that further support that your product is safe, we would definitely recommend for you to include them there. On another note, if you do not plan to provide any in vivo or in vitro toxicological studies, then in that case, we would highly suggest that your literature review is as complete as possible. So you will need to include information definitely on human safety, if there is. Okay, question 3. Can safety be supported only by a literature review? So this ties in really nicely with the previous question. the answer is yes. You can support the safety of your product with just a very good, complete literature review. If that literature review is enough for you to conclude that your product is safe, it should be enough. So first, I would check, well, I would make sure that your novel food, is it absorbed? Because if you can demonstrate negligible absorption of your novel food, that is another justification to EFSA that you don't need to provide higher tier toxicological studies, okay? However, if you do see that there are some inconsistencies in the literature, then EFSA definitely might request in a clock stop to provide more information by, as you have seen with the clock stops, by providing in vitro or in vivo studies to support the safety. For question 4, this is bacteria and yeast listed in the QPS list. Are they included, I think, from novel food definition? Or no, excluded, sorry. Are they excluded from the novel food definition? No. So, what is QPS? QPS is known as Qualified Presumption of Safety, and this is a list that EFSA has prepared and maintains, so it is updated on the regular, of bacteria and yeast that EFSA has concluded that they are safe for humans, for animals, and the environment, okay? But even though EFSA has concluded on safety, that does not mean that you should not provide a novel food dossier. They are two separate things. It only means that your safety data package is going to be less. So let's say that you have a microorganism that you want to sell as a novel food. First, you would check if your microorganism is QPS. So you would check the list of the QPS. Let's say that you find it in the QPS list. Next step is to check if it matches with all the qualifiers in the QPS list. So for example, some of the species included in the QPS list specifically say that they are only to be used for production purposes of enzymes for food enzymes, for example. So in that case, your species or your strain will not agree with that qualifier, so it wouldn't be QPS. But in case, let's say we confirm it is QPS, you will also need to provide clear taxonomic identification. So once you have done all those three, taxonomic identification, you have checked its QPS and it qualifies with the QPS qualifiers, then actually no other safety data will be needed. However, let's say that you have a species that is not QPS. What do you do then? Then you have to provide more information, and this usually is the WGS analysis, so the whole genome sequence analysis, and bioinformatic analysis. So you'll have to show through the bioinformatic analysis that your species is does not pose any toxigenic potential, that your species does not produce antimicrobials, and is safe, basically. And if we take a step further from that, so well, let's say that you have a food that is produced by production strain, so via fermentation. Well, the type of data that you will need will be even more. So besides the bioinformatic analysis, besides the taxonomic identification, you will also need to provide information. As we actually have seen from one of the clock stops, you will have to provide information that no DNA of the production strain is found in your final product, and no viable cells of production strain is also found in your final product. And on top of that, if your strain is a genetically modified strain, production strain, then you will also need to provide all the genetic modification steps just to show how it was constructed. So as you can see, no, having a QPS does not mean that you're not providing a novel food dossier. It only means that you might be eligible to provide less data, and there are some conditions depending the type of microorganism. I think this is our last question that I have. I do see that you're sending me questions through the chat. I'll take a look at them really quickly. So the last question is data protection. Sorry, I just cannot see. I have this bar over the question. Okay. So data protection. What applies? What are the benefits? Does it apply to traditional foods? Really good question to summarize our presentation. So as you know, data protection can be requested if you have proprietary data. They are exclusive to you. For example, as we have seen, toxicity studies. So the benefit is that once you achieve data protection, that is stated in the union list. That is also stated on the authorizing implementing regulation. So that means that the authorization of your novel food is not generic. So no other applicant will just be able to commercialize that product onto the market. They will have to provide their own novel food application. Okay, so your data is protected. They can't use it, but also your novel food is protected. So data protection mostly slows down your competition in achieving their novel food status. And the question, does it apply to traditional foods? So traditional foods, they are a sort of a subset of novel foods. So they are novel foods. They have not been consumed in Europe before 15th of May 1997, but they have been consumed to quite an extent in a third country by a significant amount of population. And with traditional foods, you have to show that your history of consumption data that is traced back, I think, 25 years. So does data protection apply to traditional foods? No. Data protection does not apply to traditional foods. Traditional foods are actually, they have a different notification process than novel foods, which is actually shorter. You provide less information, even on safety. There is less safety requirement data for traditional foods. And because of that, applicants are able to achieve a faster time to market with traditional foods, but it doesn't mean that they can achieve data protection. So I think this is the last question. If I look at the time, I think there's only 3 minutes left. I do see that I have received a few Q&A questions, but there are quite a few. So what I'll do, I'll reply to all of them individually over email, because there are just too many for me to reply. So with that being said, I want to say thank you. Thank you for attending this webinar and listening so far. It has been my pleasure to present to you today. If you do have some time and you have enjoyed this webinar, please do check our other webinars. You can find them on our website, penandtechconsulting.eu, and I think you will enjoy them too. So with that being said, thank you everyone. Have a very good day.